Could South Sudan slip into another civil war? Fighting in the northeast is endangering an already fragile power-sharing agreement. With a war ongoing in neighbouring Sudan, what would a new conflict in South Sudan mean for the region? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. A fragile power-sharing agreement in the world's youngest nation is being threatened by an upsurge in violence. South Sudan's President Salva Kiir says the army is being attacked by armed groups linked to his Vice President Riek Machar. The two were on opposing sides of a 5-year civil war before agreeing to rule together in 2018. The violence has been contained to the Upper Nile State region. An armed group took control of the city of Nasir and has exchanged heavy weapons fire with government troops. It's unclear who started the fighting. A general is among those killed, and UN peacekeepers have also been attacked. In the capital, Kiir has ordered troops to surround Machar's home. Ministers and officials allied with him have also been detained. Kiir is from the Dinka ethnic group, while Machar is a Nuer. The president has urged the public to stay out of the fighting as fears grow ethnic violence may escalate.
I'm appealing to you to remain calm. I have said it time and again that our country will not go back to war. Let no one take law into their hands.
South Sudan has had a brief but turbulent history. Shortly after gaining independence, the country descended into civil war in 2013. 400,000 people were killed. The conflict ended in 2018 with Salva Kiir and Riek Machar entering into a power-sharing agreement. Under the deal, the two armed factions were supposed to merge into a single national army, a constitution was to be written and elections held, but none of those things have happened. In recent years, the civil war in neighbouring Sudan has also brought more instability. South Sudan's oil exports have been completely halted after major pipelines were disrupted. We'll go to our panel of guests to discuss this further in a moment. But first, let's speak to Nicholas Haysom. He's the UN Special Representative for South Sudan. He joins us from Juba. Thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. A simple but very worrying question for you. How close is South Sudan to another civil war?
Well, that is our principal concern. A relapse back into conflict we think would be catastrophic. It would certainly be reminiscent of the conflict, the two civil wars they've had since their independence in 2011. And it would also load the region, which has enough wars ravaging it as we speak.
As you know better than anyone else, there are all sorts of political groupings in South Sudan, but there are two main factions, one linked to the president, one linked to the vice president. Who is to blame for the current breakdown?
Well, we would probably see both parties as being responsible for the escalation of tension. And we ourselves, together with our partners in the African Union and elsewhere, have been calling for a de-escalation of that tension for some time, predicting that if the tension were to persist, it would begin to erode the stature and vigor of the peace agreement, which currently has kept people more or less in peace for the last 10 years.
You say people in peace for about 10 years, but it's not a very pleasant life for most people in South Sudan. In fact, the humanitarian conditions without a fresh conflict are pretty desperate, aren't they?
They are. We often refer to the situation here as a perfect storm. You know that there was devastating floods. There are over 1 million people have spilt over from the conflict in Sudan. That's the neighbouring country. There's been rampant inflation. There is real poverty in the country. And so it's under those circumstances that it has to deal with very delicate political issues, such as making peace.
You refer to the war in the north, that devastating conflict in Sudan. How much is this a result of the spillover from that? Because the oil from the pipeline was the main resource, the main money coming into South Sudan. And I've seen some analysts say that actually the corruption and the spoils from the oil was the glue that was keeping the country together.
Well, we don't think there's any excuse arising from the lack of oil revenue to put South Sudan on a precipice of conflict. It is something we believe the principal political stakeholders can deal with. And we, not only we in the UN, but a number of neighbouring states have for some time been calling on the leaders to exercise restraint and to call upon their followers to exercise restraint.
You are, I hope you don't mind me saying, a veteran UN official. You've led UN operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. You probably know a failed state if you see one. Is South Sudan a failed state now?
Well, I don't know if I would call it a failed state, because I would want to believe it has the potential to create the conditions for stability and democracy if its leaders were to demonstrate the necessary leadership required to steer the country in that direction. That would require the leaders to work together and to build the kinds of trust that is a prerequisite for an effective peace agreement.
But those leaders have not done that. You've had a peace agreement supposedly since 2018, but coming up with a constitution, coming up with elections, unifying the army. None of those key things have happened during the last 7 years. And you have the two same men at the top of South Sudan who've been there since the country's independence. Is it time for a new political generation and for these two men to step aside?
Well, I think we would have to go beyond the two people concerned. I think the country as a whole has to create the conditions for peace. It has to create a sense of common purpose, if I can put it that way, a common nationhood to make real progress and to create the foundation of a new state.
You have had a role in southern Sudan before it was even South Sudan. You were one of those involved in the mediation in the peace process that led up to independence in 2011. Those were exciting days. As you look back and look where things have gone now, what is your reflection on how badly things have gone wrong? Well,
first and foremost, there's obviously a profound sense of disappointment because, James, you will remember the high hopes with which the birth of the new Sudan was greeted. And it's no secret that it has failed to live up to the hopes which its neighbours and its backers and supporters invested in the project South Sudan.
Nicholas Haysom, Special Representative for the UN Secretary-General and Head of the UN Mission in South Sudan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, let's go now to our other guests today. Joining us on the panel from Nairobi, Alan Boswell, International Crisis Group's Project Director for the Horn of Africa. And from Rome, we have Nyagoah Tutpoor, who is South Sudan researcher at Human Rights Watch. Thank you both for talking to us. Nyagoah, can I start with you? You heard the UN's top man, the head of the UN mission, UNMISS, which has about 14,000 peacekeepers in the country, saying his principal concern is civil war. He said they are on the precipice. Do you believe that's the situation?
Indeed, South Sudan is at a precipice because the situation in Nasser, you cannot be read in isolation. There are many other trigger points, many other flashpoints in the country. Nasser is just one of the latest that we have seen since the beginning of the year. What we're witnessing in Nasser has had a devastating impact on civilians because since conflict there renewed in mid-February, thousands of civilians fled their homes and are in desperate conditions without access to health, without food, without access to drinking water. And, you know, Nasser, Upper Nile, and much of South Sudan has been facing a humanitarian crisis, including a cholera outbreak. So if this situation continues, the consequences for civilians will be quite dire. But even then, at the beginning in February, we saw the use of heavy weaponry, artillery, heavy weaponry, mortar shells, and including airstrikes on the government said it was at IO positions, but also civilian areas were hit. And I think about 10 civilians were killed. I think a UN peacekeeper was injured in mid-February. And also last week, 2 UN staffers, along with many others, lost their lives. So Nasser is just one issue right now in South Sudan, but there are other areas of concern, including Western Equatoria, where in the last many weeks there have been clashes that have displaced thousands of civilians from their homes. There's also other areas, including southern central Equatoria, where the government has continued a counterinsurgency campaign with the National Salvation Front, which is not party to the peace deal. So there is significant concern that this latest flashpoint might lead to if it is not handled well, if there's no de-escalation, that the consequences, especially in this situation where South Sudan has been moving from one emergency to another in a very unstable region, that the situation could escalate for civilians.
Alan, Nyagoah there just gave us quite a good summary of the flashpoints around the country. In addition to that, arrests taking place in the capital, Juba. You heard the UN Special Representative Nicholas Haysom saying both sides are responsible. How do you see it? Who is responsible for the current spark in violence?
Well, you can talk about both sides in South Sudan, but as you also mentioned in your interview with Haysom, the other major player here is the war in Sudan, if you can call it a player as well. So I think, you know, this power-sharing government in South Sudan has always had a lot of problems. There's been ongoing tension. The first vice president, who was previously the rebel leader, Riek Machar, you know, he's surrounded by President Kiir's forces in Juba, which is obviously a tense situation as it is. So we've had lots of escalation at various points within the past few years. I think what makes this time different is the amount of pressure the war on Sudan is putting on the political system on South Sudan, both in terms of a lost revenue, but also in terms of the conflict itself, which is now very much raging on South Sudan's border, and a very polarized regional environment in which you have some countries supporting one side, some countries the other, and it's just getting very difficult for South Sudan, which is very fragile, very weak, has all these fissures within it. It's getting what we're really worried about is basically, if you have a political crisis, you have a security crisis, that this could merge with the war in Sudan and grow quite big.
Nyagoah, can you take up that point about the war in the much bigger northern neighbour? There seem to be two things there. The double refugees. Some had fled to Sudan from South Sudan. They're coming back again, and other refugees coming from Sudan, and also the economy and the shutting down of it's not operating anyway, of the oil pipeline.
Well, the first is because we have over 1 million people that have fled the Sudan war into South Sudan. And this, since 2023, has really exacerbated, or it has created a huge stress on the humanitarian sector in South Sudan. Those who are coming to South Sudan, majority of them are South Sudanese returnees who have fled multiple times. They fled South Sudan for Sudan, and many then had to flee back. But there are also many Sudanese who have fled to South Sudan, and have also moved to other parts in the region, and so we're seeing that the conflict in Sudan, which Human Rights Watch, has been documenting since the beginning, and Human Rights Watch has been calling for a protection of civilian mandates, as well as for the arms embargo in Darfur to be extended across the whole country. And so if the conflict in Sudan is not addressed, Sudan and South Sudan, despite the separation, have continued to be attached at the hip because of many issues, socially, politically, and economically. And so it is not a wild guess that as the conflict in Sudan continues, and it also makes the borders porous, the possibility of arms flowing between the two countries very easy as well. So it creates a much more tense situation in South Sudan. And now what we're seeing, what's also very concerning and, reminds us of events of 2013 and the early period of South Sudan's war, is the arrest of key opposition leaders and the threat by the security service to continue this arrest. And so, in spite of the fact that the president has urged for calm, if these arrests continue and the detention of key leaders continues, arbitrary detentions without charge, without due process, then this in itself is a worrying point.
Alan, I believe you were a journalist 14 years ago at the time of independence and covered the situation in South Sudan. I mean, it was a very upbeat picture, wasn't it, at the time? This is a country with oil riches. It has timber, minerals. It has livestock it can export. What's gone wrong?
Well, you need more than oil revenue to build a country, I would say. And in fact, having oil revenue when you haven't decided how to share that oil revenue or have any institutions to manage it might actually make the thing worse. So I think, like you said, I was around at the time. I tried asking a lot of these questions, saying, how are we so sure this will go right? There's a lot of signs it'll go very wrongly. And what I found at the time is that people basically had overconfidence that we know how to build a nation, that we know how to build a state. And I think some of that filtered down to South Sudanese elite, unfortunately, where they felt like, with the international support they were going, that, that they didn't have to think too seriously about some of these matters and could, meanwhile, they just fell into civil war instead. And they basically had a scramble, a sort of king of the hill scramble for controlling this oil revenue. And now many people call South Sudan the most corrupt country on the planet, which is what happens when you have a giant pot of oil money, no institutions, and no political settlement about how to govern the country. So I think there's a lot of blame to be shared among many. I also think, frankly, something like this probably wouldn't happen nowadays, where there's is an era in which people still believed in nation building and state building to a degree that I think now is no longer there.
Nyagoah, if we look at it, of course, after independence, South Sudan became a completely separate country, but there is, it seems, a little bit of a sad symmetry between what has happened in Sudan and South Sudan. Certainly in Sudan, a war that's tied very much to two men. Let me ask you about the situation in South Sudan. How much does it come down to these two leaders?
Well, given that they have dominated the political scene, the two leaders are not the only signatories to the peace deal. They're not the only stakeholders to the peace agreement. We also forget that civil society, women leaders, academics all oversaw the signing of this peace agreement. And while we tend to focus on the two main principals who have shaped the political scene of South Sudan for, since 2005, after the death of John Garang. There are also a lot of other stakeholders involved, the African Union, the UN, IGAD, and various donors and who are involved in this peace process. So it's about holding these processes to these individuals to account, but also about ensuring that certain mechanisms that have been put in place, such as an arms embargo, such as sanctions and travel bans, that the region, implements some of these mechanisms that have been put in place, and that there are processes towards ensuring accountability for the many horrendous, horrific crimes that we have documented and many others have documented since conflict broke out in 2013. So at the end of the day, yes, Machar and Kiir and President Kiir seem to be the two people that hold much of the influence in South Sudan. But as many civil society activists will tell you, the country is bigger and the future belongs to many South Sudanese.
Nyagoah, just to be clear, though, on that point you were making about crimes being committed and these being the two men who've been in charge and have been feuding against each other for so long, what's the position of Human Rights Watch? Should these two men actually be facing charges?
Because human rights abuses, serious crimes have been committed where there is command responsibility, individuals who are responsible for the serious crimes should be facing trials. And if there is evidence pinning up to the two top men, including for crimes committed by their respective forces, then there should be accountability towards the president as well as towards vice president, the first vice president, Riek Machar.
Alan, what's your view on these two leaders? I mean, would you agree that the time has come for them both to leave the stage, but the only way that might happen was if there was a deal that would lead to an election? And of course, there was a plan in 2018. There was supposed to even be elections at the end of last year, and this is a country that's never had elections.
Yeah, correct. Since independence in 2011, South Sudan has never managed to hold elections. I'd say the political jockeying right now in Juba is no longer about elections. It's more about President Kiir and his succession. I think the general view is that there will probably not be elections, or at least Kiir will probably not step down while he is still alive. And so a lot of the jockeying now among South Sudanese political elite is basically what happens, what happens when President Kiir is no longer around, essentially, and what that means for Riek Machar. So, I mean, we might see a situation where these, where these two men continue to hold South Sudan, for as long, hold it hostage in a sense for as long as they can. But I will say, I mean, we talk about these two men, but they both hold together respective political coalitions. And even when they're gone, South Sudan is likely to still face many of the problems unless they can sit down and essentially do what they should have done before independence, which is sit down and have a proper national discussion about what power in the country looks like, how they will structure the country, how oil revenue will be spent, et cetera. And they just didn't do that before their independence, and no one made them.
Nyagoah, you mentioned earlier on the international and regional actors in all of this, and there are lots of them. Mr. Haysom's United Nations, the force he leads, 14,000 peacekeepers he has on the ground. You have the African Union involved. You have the regional grouping IGAD. You have the European Union. You have what's known as the Troika, which are three countries that were involved from before the time of independence: Norway, the US, and the UK. Has the international community got to accept some blame for the mess that is South Sudan?
Absolutely. In as much as South Sudanese leaders, should get a lot of the blame for the suffering that has been imposed on South Sudanese, there is a lot more that the region and the international community can do. And if you are to look back, of course, hindsight is a beautiful thing. But if you're to look back over the last 10 years, there have been missteps as well. Chief of which, at Human Rights Watch, we have been advocating for the establishment of a hybrid court that would try, investigate, and try individuals who are responsible for the most serious of abuses. This court which the African Union has, part in its establishment, has not been established to date. When you look at the regional neighbors and the regional players, since an arms embargo was established in 2018, they have found ways to ensure, where this arms embargo has been violated, including with, the participation of regional actors and regional players who facilitated, the transfer of weapons and other issues as well. There's also calling things what they are. Of course, we're seeing a flurry of international, and we have to give credit as well. The statements that are being made, the very strong statements urging for de-escalation, that's a good step. But this needs to be sustained, and definitely.
Alan, we've talked about international attention. One country that's pulling out its people from Juba, diplomats and others, is the US. The US was one of the most enthusiastic countries in the creation of South Sudan. Yet the US, under the Trump administration, has all sorts of cuts. Is the US doing what it should, given the US's role throughout the early days of Sudan? Is it playing its part now?
As you note, the U.S. played a major role in South Sudan's independence. I think, most within the region and in South Sudan, I think many basically credited the U.S. with securing South Sudan's independence. And the U.S. has more or less washed its hands of South Sudan, I would say, for quite a number of years now. I think, what we'll see under the Trump administration is an even greater a step back as well. So, in terms of countries who are really still involved and can make a difference, we're mostly looking at African states, especially neighboring regional countries. Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa is still a major player. When it comes to de-escalating this current crisis, trying to prevent a full-out civil war, it's those places, as well as the ongoing UN mission, that people are going to be looking at to try and help resolve this, or at least mitigate it.
Thank you very much, and thank you to both our guests today, Alan Boswell and Nyagoah Tutpoor, and to Nicholas Haysom, who joined us earlier. If you didn't catch all of the conversation, no problem. You can watch it again anytime you want on our website, aljazeera.com. What should we discuss next time? Your thoughts and suggestions are welcome. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or use X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'll be back in this chair very soon. Until then, from me, James Bays, and all the team here in Doha, stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.